I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I'm professor of philosophy here at Gonzaga and chair of the Environmental Studies Department. This lecture is part of our ongoing series of events that we hold a number of these throughout the year. If you go to gonzaga.edu/environmental studies, you can find a list of our events. Our next one, just to get you primed here, is on Tuesday, October 29th, in the evening. Dr. Goodstein from Bard College will be speaking on how to solve climate by 2030. So if you go to Gonzaga's Environmental Studies Department website, you can find more information on that event on October 29th in the evening. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Ben Goldfarb. Before he became an award-winning author, Ben majored in English and Environmental Studies at Amherst College. So you environmental studies students, well, get busy here. Like many environmental studies graduates, he then, after graduating, wandered around through a succession of field ecology jobs, working for the National Park Service in Yellowstone, New York City Parks Department, tagged sea turtles in North Carolina, which sounds really interesting. Then decided to go back to school, earned a Master's of Environmental Management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, expecting to continue on the trajectory as a professional advocate or a conservationist, but then decided that what he really loved was writing, and so he figured out a way to combine these two loves in the environment and writing, and became an environmental journalist, and has written for outlets all over the country: Scientific American, The Guardian, National Geographic, High Country News, and many others. You can find his work all over the place. But he's here tonight to speak to us about his book, Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. That book was a winner of the Best Outdoor Book of 2018 by Outside Magazine. It also won the E.O. Wilson Prize for Literary Science Writing from PEN America. And his next project he's working on, as a result of being awarded an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, he's working on a book with a working title, I don't know if it's changed since I got this, was Mean Streets, Road Ecology, and the Future of Transportation Infrastructure. So maybe we'll have him back when he gets that next book out. We're very fortunate tonight, and join me in welcoming Ben Goldfarb.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Great. So thank you so much to Brian for that warm introduction, and to you all for being here tonight to talk about beavers with me. I moved to Spokane about a year and a half ago, and one of the reasons I was really excited to come here is that we're sort of at the forefront of the re-beavering of the American West. The Spokane River, as many of you guys know, is full of beavers. And here on the Gonzaga campus, of course, Lake Arthur has at least 2 active beaver lodges, and I have seen beavers there. So I was really, I'm excited to be here in front of what I hope is a very beaver-savvy audience. And this is Joe Cannon, who used to work for the Lands Council, running their beaver program, and I believe this is Lake Arthur. We're in a good beaver setting in a lot of ways, I think. So the book that I wrote is ostensibly about beavers, but to me what it's really about is seeing. It's about understanding why our landscapes look the way they do, and how they've changed over the millennia as the result of the activity of this very influential rodent. So I just wanted to begin my talk tonight by reading briefly from the book about the ways in which beavers change our landscape and the ways in which the destruction of beavers changed North America. So this is from the introduction to Eager. And again, just think about the landscapes that we inhabit and how they've changed over time. Close your eyes. Picture, if you will, a healthy stream. What comes to mind? Perhaps you've conjured a crystalline, fast-moving creek bounding merrily over rocks, its course narrow and shallow enough that you could leap or wade across the channel. If, like me, you're a fly fisherman, you might add a cheerful, knee-deep angler, casting for trout in a limpid riffle. It's a lovely picture, fit for an Orvis catalog. It's also wrong. Let's try again. This time, I want you to perform a more difficult imaginative feat. Instead of envisioning a present-day stream, I want you to reach into the past, before the mountain men, before the pilgrims, before Hudson and Champlain and the other horsemen of the fur apocalypse, all the way back to the 1500s. I want you to imagine the streams that existed before global capitalism purged a continent of its dam-building, water-storing, wetland-creating engineers. I want you to imagine a landscape with its full complement of beavers. What do you see this time? No longer is our stream a narrow, racing trickle. Instead, it's a sluggish, murky swamp, backed up several acres by a messy chain of woody dams. Gnawed stumps ring the marsh like punji sticks. Dead and dying trees stand aslant in the chest-deep pond. When you step into the water, you feel not rocks underfoot, but sludge. The musty stink of decomposition wafts into your nostrils. If there's a fisherman here, he's thrashing angrily in the willows, his fly caught in a tree. Although this beavery tableau isn't going to appear in any field and stream spreads, it's in many cases a more historically accurate picture, and in crucial ways, a much healthier one. In the Intermountain West, wetlands, though they make up just 2% of total land area, support 80% of biodiversity. You may not hear the tinkle of running water in our swamp, but listen closely for the songs of warblers and flycatchers perched in creekside willows. Frogs croak along the pond's marshy aprons. Otters chase trout through the submerged branches of downed trees, a forest inverted. The deep water and the close vegetation make the fishing tough, but abundant trout shelter in the meandering side channels and cold depths. And a river runs through it. Norman Maclean captured the trials and ecstasies of angling in beaver country when he wrote of one character. So off he went happily to wade in ooze and to get throttled by brush and to fall through loose piles of sticks called beaver dams and to end up with a wreath of seaweed round his neck and a basket full of fish. That's how I got into beavers in a big way, was fishing. So in the restoration ecology world, we tend to talk a lot about what beavers do as though they're tools that we can deploy on the landscape. But I do think it's important to take a minute to appreciate the beaver as an organism, as an evolutionary marvel. So what's a beaver? What kind of animal is a beaver? Somebody just shout it out. What's a beaver? It's a rodent, yeah. It's North America's largest rodent. What's the world's largest rodent? Anybody know that one? The capybara, right. Yeah, you're obviously a very rodent-savvy person. Yeah. So beavers they're quite large. I think they're much bigger than most people expect. They're a typical adult beaver is 50 to 60 pounds. So they're pretty hefty animals. And of course they're semi-aquatic rodents, right? Which means they spend most of their lives in and around water. And they've got lots of really remarkable adaptations for this unique semi-aquatic life they lead. Of course they've got remarkably dense fur. They've got as many hairs on a postage stamp-sized patch of skin as we humans have on our entire heads. So extraordinarily dense fur, which of course is important when you live in the water in the northern latitudes and have to stay warm somehow. They've got these fantastic duck-like hind feet, webbed feet. So they're very agile and powerful in the water. How long can a beaver hold its breath? Any guesses? You're disqualified. So up to 15 minutes. So they're remarkable underwater. They've actually got a second set of eyelids, transparent eyelids called nictitating membranes. They can close over their eyes to act as goggles underwater. They've got a second set of lips, a set of fur-lined lips like a valve behind their front teeth, so they can chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. That's a really cool adaptation, I think. And then what's a beaver's most iconic feature? What makes a beaver recognizably a beaver? The tail, right, exactly. The tail is really this remarkable multi-purpose appendage. Who's ever heard a beaver tail slap? Is that a sound that's familiar to you guys? You can go down to Lake Arthur and hear that most nights. So basically, beaver whacks its tail on the water to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. It's also a rudder as they swim. It's a kickstand when they're out on land on their hind legs gnawing on a tree. And it's also a fat storage device. They actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. And it's also a thermoregulatory organ. So at the base of the tail is this specialized network of capillaries they use to exchange hot and cold and keep their body temperature stable. So the tail is really an extraordinary organ. And then, of course, the other iconic beaver feature is the teeth, right? So beavers' teeth are orange. What's going on there? Why are beavers' teeth orange? They're chemically and structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their food. So they've got incredibly durable, powerful teeth, which obviously is important when you spend your whole life gnawing down trees. So what do beavers eat? Who here thinks that beavers eat fish? that a misapprehension that we hold? Okay, good. Just checking. So beavers are completely herbivorous. They only eat vegetation. And what they eat from trees is they eat the cambium, which is the inner bark of trees. That's kind of the layer of bark that does the growing. That's the good sugary stuff. They also eat lots of green herbaceous vegetation, cattails, water lilies. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. They eat grass very happily. And beavers are what scientists call choosy generalists. So what does that mean? It means they've got a few species of tree that they really like. What's a preferred beaver food tree? What do beavers like? Aspen, what else? Willow, what else? Cottonwood is another big one. Pretty much any deciduous tree, right? So they've got their, in the West, it's really aspen, cottonwood, willow. Those are the big three. But they'll eat just about any deciduous tree. They do tend to avoid conifers, but not always. So remarkably diverse diets, but entirely herbivorous. So in addition to using to eating the cambium from trees, they're also using the trees they cut as construction material. Right here's a beaver kind of mid material transport. And there are really two basic types of beaver structures, things that they're using the wood to build. What would you call this beaver structure? A lodge, right. That's the basic beaver housing unit. And a lodge typically houses 2 or 3 to as many as 8 beavers or so. That's the mating pair, the male and female, who are generally monogamous, though not exclusively. You've got the newborn kits, the baby beavers who are born in the spring, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So you've got 3 kind of year classes of offspring all inhabiting the lodge together, working on lodge maintenance together. So they're kind of remarkably cooperative breeders, is the scientist term for them. This is a kind of a cool view of a lodge in Minnesota that I saw, in which you can see it. So this is the situation where the beavers left the area, the pond drained, the lodge has been abandoned, but because the water is down, what you can see very nicely is all of the different entrances and exits, right? So inside the lodge, so beavers have a number of different sort of escape routes and ways up into the lodge. And inside the lodge, there's kind of a nesting platform, an elevated chamber, so they can stay dry and out of the water. So the lodge is really an incredible structure. And then what's the second iconic beaver structure? What would you call that? That's the dam, right. So why do beavers build dams? What is the point of this really bizarre, specialized behavior? What are they doing when they build one of these structures? They're stopping water, right. Why would you want to stop water if you're a beaver? To make a pond, why would you want a pond? To make food and to be safe, right? That's really the big one. Is a beaver on land, as one biologist put it to me, is a fat, slow, smelly package of meat, right? They're kind of these big, clumsy animals wandering around, getting eaten by cougars, black bears, coyotes, you name it. Anything large with sharp teeth is going to be very happy eating a beaver. So by creating this pond and expanding and deepening the water, they're basically engineering their own shelter, right? They're creating this big pool where they can be safe from predators. So instead of having to walk overland to get to that tasty-looking aspen tree and get eaten by a wolf on the way, they can swim up to it instead and cut it down and drag it back to the lodge or dam in relative safety. So, yeah, access to food and shelter is kind of the crucial thing. And individual beaver colonies or beaver families can build an awful lot of dams. They come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. This is a dam in Montana that you could probably jump across in a single bound. That's kind of a typical small one. But they do get quite a bit bigger. Here's one in Minnesota. That's me. I'm about 6'4", so that's probably a 14 or 15 foot dam right there, and that's probably the cumulative labors of dozens of generations of beavers, all sort of collaborating on this really amazing structure. So they're really extraordinary engineers. And I think the cool thing about beavers, too, is they not only build enormous dams, they're also really good strategic dam builders, right? I mean, this particular dam is basically at the mouth of this sort of narrow canyon that backs up into this huge, several hundred-acre wetland. So by building a dam in this very strategic place, they're maximizing the size of the pond, right? Even if you said to, an engineer with the Army Corps, hey, where's the best spot to build a dam in this drainage, they would choose the exact same place as the beavers. So the beavers, they have kind of remarkable hydraulic sense, I think. And the other fantastic thing that beavers do that I think they don't get enough credit for is they're also amazing canal diggers, right? We think of beavers as being these amazing builders of woody structures, but they're also really prolific excavators. And what they're doing is basically they're building these canals up into the forest so they can swim up rather than walking up and be safe again, and then drag branches back down to the main ponds. And these canals turn out to be really important in terms of spreading water out on the landscape, right? Instead of isolating the water in a pond, these canals are basically irrigating these really large areas. And it's that sort of irrigation ability combined with the pond building ability that makes beavers what scientists call a keystone species, right? So what does that mean? Well, it's a term from architecture. So in architecture, you've got kind of the typical, if you can imagine a stone arch, the block of granite or whatever at the center of the arch, at the apex of the arch, is the keystone, right, that holds up the entire arch. And if you remove that keystone, the arch crumbles. And beavers are playing a similar role, especially in ecosystems in the American West. As I said in the introduction to the book, wetlands are 2% of total land area, but support 80% of the life. So any animal that's capable of creating and maintaining those wetlands is disproportionately important, right? We know that every species has its place in an ecosystem, but some species are bearing more weight than others, and beavers are sort of disproportionately crucial, I think, in maintaining habitat. So what kind of creatures depend on beaver-built habitats? Well, obviously waterfowl breed and feed in and around beaver ponds. That's a wood duck. We know that many amphibians, frogs, salamanders, are almost beaver pond obligates, so they rely on beaver ponds for breeding territories. Of course, fish, beavers are expanding the extent of water, so fish are obvious beaver beneficiaries, and we'll talk more about salmon specifically later. So those are all obvious ones, right? Waterfowl, frogs, fish, these are animals that live in and around water. You'd expect them to benefit from an animal that expands and creates water. But there are also lots of really cool terrestrial connections as well, I think, animals that you wouldn't necessarily associate with beaver ponds, like songbirds. When beavers cut willow trees and those willows re-sprout, they form this kind of dense, coppice, shrubby substrate or strata. And songbirds use those dense willow shrubs as really important nesting and feeding areas. So there's lots of great research about passerines, songbirds, being beaver beneficiaries. This is the St. Francis satyr. It's the rarest butterfly in North America. The reason it's so rare is that its caterpillars feed exclusively on sedges that grow in beaver wetlands. So when we wiped out beavers, we wiped out this butterfly. And the way to bring the butterfly back is to restore beavers. So beavers and butterflies, right? You wouldn't necessarily think about that. How about bats? Bats are another crucial beaver pond beneficiary. You get these big, broad beaver ponds. Aquatic insects hatch and emerge, and bats just swoop in there and use those ponds as buffets. And there's lots of great emergent research on the connection between bats and beaver ponds. So there are all of these. There's this huge suite of species that's enormously dependent on beavers, including some candidates that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So historically, of course, we know that beavers were a much more prevalent, dominant force upon the landscape. And a lot of what I tried to do in the book was to sort of reconstruct these historical, pre-colonial, beaver-dominated ecosystems, right? What did North America look like before we wiped out several 100 million beavers? We don't know how many beavers were here, but the kind of the top bound of the estimate is 400 million. And those beavers would have created hundreds of millions of acres of pond and wetland habitat. So what did North America look like with all of those beavers? We don't really know, but by reading trappers and explorers' journals, we can get a little taste, a little flavor. So here's a quote from the Lewis and Clark diaries. Lewis was a very astute beaver naturalist, lots of beaver observations in the Corps of Discovery's journals. This one is from July 18th, 1805. At this point in their journey, the core of discovery is in the Missouri Basin in what is today Montana. And Lewis remarks that Captain Clark saw a number of beaver dams succeeding each other in close order and extending as far up those streams as he could discover them in their course towards the mountain. So he's making these kinds of observations every single day, right? The core of discovery is moving up the Missouri River, and every single tributary they pass has beaver dams and ponds, one on top of the other, as far as the eye can see, up into the mountains. And actually, in many places, Lewis and Clark couldn't use these valleys. They had to either walk along the ridge lines or stick to the main stem of the Missouri because these little tributaries were so chock full of beavers that the land was essentially impassable. You know, LaSalle, who was sort of one of the early explorers of the American Midwest, writes in his journal about not being able to find a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had so thoroughly impounded the Midwest. So we know that we lived in this much more watery, lush, green, beaver-dominated landscape. So that was in 1805 that Lewis and Clark saw beaver dams in every stream as far as the eye could see. In 1843, I believe, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, the famous naturalist and painter, traveled the exact same route. And he was trying to find a beaver to paint. He'd moved on from birds and was doing mammals. He was in his mammal phase. And he's looking for a beaver, and he couldn't find a single beaver in the exact same watershed that Lewis and Clark had found them ubiquitous. So what happened to beavers in less than 4 decades? How did we go from beavers in every single stream to no beavers whatsoever? What did they turn into? Hats. Yeah, exactly. They became these things. I think that we hear the phrase beaver hat and think of like a big furry Davy Crockett-like thing. But in fact, beaver hats were these sort of elegant Victorian-style top hats, although they came in many different styles, really. And the trajectory of the fur trade is basically, so there are 2 species of beaver. There's the North American beaver and the Eurasian beaver, very closely related sister species. So the Europeans basically wiped out beavers from Europe and Asia and then arrived in North America, basically looking for a new source of pelts. And the reason that beavers made such fantastic hat-making material is that beavers actually have 2 layers of fur. And I've actually got I do support the beaver trapping industry in some ways. So on a beaver, there are 2 layers of fur. There's the kind of the coarse outer guard hairs, the longer hairs, and then beneath that, there's this under fur, this beaver wool. And you can even just pass this around if you want. My dog chewed a hole in that is the one thing to keep in mind. So the under fur, if you look at all of these little under hairs under a microscope, what you'd see is that each little under hair has a little hook or barb at the end, which makes them lock together like Velcro, essentially, which is how the beaver waterproofs itself, but also makes a really durable, malleable, waterproof hat-making material. That's kind of the finest hat stuff in all of North America. And it's hard to overstate what a historically significant event beaver trapping was, right? When early European colonists arrive in North America, beavers, along with timber and cod, are really the most important resource that they encounter. In the early 1600s, you've got trappers or traders like Henry Hudson, Champlain, Adrian Block, basically extracting as many pelts from the eastern seaboard as possible, primarily trading with Native Americans to receive these furs and ship them back to Europe or have them made into hats in North America. And over the course of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, this fur trade gradually expands westward, basically eliminating beavers from every single river, lake, pond, stream that they encounter. And one kind of amazing metric of how historically and economically significant the fur trade was. So here, in the inland Northwest, we're here in what was historically the Oregon Territory. And the Oregon Territory actually minted these beaver coins. So the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt. So as people advocate going to the gold standard today. The economy of the Oregon Territory operated on the pelt standard. That's how integral beaver trapping was to the early kind of post-colonial North American economy. Every historical event before the Civil War had some kind of beaver connection. The Louisiana Purchase was largely fueled by the desire to secure new trapping grounds. When the Pilgrims arrived in what is today Massachusetts, they owed lots of money to their creditors back in Europe, and the only way they could repay those debts was by shipping pelts back across the Atlantic. So beavers made the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony possible. It was early white beaver traders and trappers who spread smallpox and many of the diseases that ravaged many Native American tribes. So the story of the beaver trade is really the story of early American history in all of its kind of grandeur and tragedy and stupidity. So in addition to being a hugely consequential historical event, the beaver trade was also a hugely consequential ecological or environmental event. We don't really think about beaver trapping in the same terms as we think about the deforestation of New England or the busting of the Midwestern prairie for agriculture or gold mining in California. We don't think about beaver trapping as one of the things that fundamentally changed what North America looked like, but we really should. What happens when you eliminate 400 million beavers? Well, all of those beaver dams break down and all of those beaver ponds drain. And you're left with the desiccation of hundreds of millions of acres of wetlands. One really extraordinary statistic or fact that kind of gets at what a dramatic event this was is the fact that in New England, you've got the arrival of the fur trade in the early 1600s. And so many dams broke down in Connecticut, Massachusetts, southern New York, that as all of those ponds drained to the ocean, all of that organic matter, all of that carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus rushed into the ocean out of beaver ponds. It fertilized this enormous algae bloom, which then settled to the bottom of the Long Island Sound. So today, if you take a sediment core of the Long Island Sound, you can find this layer of algae that was fertilized by the destruction of beaver ponds. That's how dramatic an event this was, that it's written in the floor of the ocean itself. And of course, it was a cataclysm for all of those species that I mentioned before, right? All of those waterfowl, amphibians, fish, songbirds. What did it mean for cutthroat trout or moose that we lost hundreds of millions of acres of beaver infrastructure? We don't really know, but there's no question it was this enormously consequential ecological disaster. So by the mid to late 19th century, beavers are pretty much wiped out of North America. There are still several tens of thousands up in Canada primarily, but they're basically gone from the Rocky Mountains, from New England certainly, from the Southeast, the Midwest. They're all but gone in the lower 48 certainly. But right about that time, right about the turn of the century, the tide for beavers begins to turn. It's sort of the dawning of the conservation era, right? People like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot are kind of leading this environmental awakening, and all of these fish and game agencies around the country, especially in the American West, begin to realize, hey, we probably made a mistake by essentially eliminating this animal from our landscape. And Enos Mills, who is kind of a mentee of John Muir's, wrote a really wonderful book called In Beaver World, where he kind of captured this changing zeitgeist and posited that a live beaver is more valuable to mankind than a dead one, which was a kind of a heretical, radical notion at the time. But gradually, all of these state agencies begin to reintroduce beavers from the western states that they've been eliminated from. So Washington actually had a big beaver reintroduction program in the early 20th century, Oregon, California, Utah, you name it. That said, the most famous, certainly, and kind of most radical re-beavering project actually occurred in Idaho. Have you guys heard of the Idaho beaver reintroduction? Fortunately, some YouTube footage survives. Let's see if this plays. Come on.
Tags are attached for future information.
Okay, cool. So this footage is from a YouTube video called Fur for the Future, which you guys can all find later. It's very cool. And basically, this is all taking place in 1948. And Idaho is trying to reintroduce beavers to the area that is today the Frank Church Wilderness. And the first plan is to move them on horseback into the backcountry. The horses don't like that very much, as you might imagine. But fortunately, it's 1948, so just post-World War II. There are all of these airplanes and surplus parachutes kind of lying around. And one of these Idaho state biologists has the bright idea of airdropping some beavers into the backcountry. So they basically tested this out on a kind of a crash test beaver named Geronimo, of course. Once Geronimo got the hang of it, they did this en masse. So in 1948, they moved 76 beavers into the Frank Church Wilderness via parachute. When they flew back over the same landscape, they found that beavers had set up ponds and wetlands in all of the places they'd been relocated. So it was a very successful program. Only one beaver escaped from his crate midair, unfortunately, and fell to his death. So there was one casualty. But overall, it was a very successful program and is no longer considered state-of-the-art. Nobody is moving beavers that way, as far as I know. So throughout the 20th century, you've got all of these state-led beaver reintroduction programs. You've got beaver populations, which had been down to 100,000 or so in North America, very rapidly recovering. You know, beavers, of course, because they engineer their own habitat, are very good at essentially carving out space for themselves and begin to recolonize many of the places that they were trapped out of. The problem, of course, is that in the intervening decades, we have colonized those exact same places, right? It turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat are one and the same, right? We both like broad, fertile floodplains and low gradient streams and river valleys. We like to settle near water. And a lot of the same places that beavers are moving back into are places that we have since built our roads and towns and farms and rail lines. And of course, as beavers and humans share the same space, conflict does tend to arise. So here's kind of a typical story. This is in Massachusetts. This is a picture I took in 2017, I believe. And basically the story here was that this railroad track had just been refurbished at a cost of about $1 million. And within 2 months of finishing this track, beavers had it underwater. So you could argue, well, who's really the nuisance in this case? But there's no question that beavers are being challenging in this instance. Here's another picture I took in New Mexico a couple of years ago. You can see that that cabin up there is basically underwater. And what's kind of hard to see in this picture, but is really cool, I think, is that beavers have basically, you can see in the top left corner, beavers have basically built their dam up to the porch of the cabin, then incorporated the cabin in the dam, and then continued building on the right side. So I think that, I wouldn't want to be that landowner, but you have to sort of admire the ingenuity of the beavers in that instance. Another very common beaver behavior is building in road culverts, right? If you're a beaver, swimming along, the road bed is like the greatest dam in the world, and the culvert is the leak in the dam, and beavers hate leaks. That's like their whole thing, is plugging up leaks. So beavers very frequently build in road culverts, which causes the water to rise and the road to wash out, which is a very expensive thing to maintain. So that's a very common beaver problem. They do get more creative sometimes. This is a beaver that broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was actually browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack when it was apprehended. I feel like there's a metaphor in there somewhere for our modern environmental condition. So beavers get into all kinds of random nuisance and mischief. They're definitely challenging animals to coexist with in a lot of ways. So the way that these sorts of beaver conflicts are generally handled is by trapping out the offending beaver. Right, here's the typical leg hold trap. So in the United States, the federal government, the Department of Agriculture, kills 20 to 25,000 beavers every year. And then private trappers kill certainly many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of beavers more. And certainly there are some beaver-related conflicts that are probably only possible to solve lethally. But there are a couple of problems, in my opinion, with sort of our reflexive, knee-jerk, lethal approach to beaver beaver mischief. I mean, the first, of course, is that when you eliminate the beavers, you're also eliminating all of that great pond and wetland habitat that we know is so important for other species. But from a kind of a more dollars and cents standpoint, we know that when we trap out beavers, all we're doing is creating a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as the habitat is there, the beavers have this almost magical way of reappearing. So how can we solve these beaver-related problems without resorting to trapping in every situation? Well, certainly when the issue is tree cutting or tree felling, that's a very easy problem to solve. And actually, Spokane is really good about this. You walk along Riverfront Park and you see, it seems like every single deciduous tree has some kind of fencing around it, which I think is really wonderful. I commend the city of Spokane and the Lands Council for taking this very proactive approach to beaver-proofing the city. This is a fence around some native cottonwoods in Colorado at a reservoir. And what's cool about this site is that, so in this situation, a local nonprofit had protected the native cottonwoods, the trees that they wanted to keep around, and left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm. So in this case, beavers were actually doing invasive species control on behalf of the humans. I thought that was kind of a cool example of how you can sort of harness beaver behavior to productive ends. When the problem is flooding, I mean, that's kind of a more difficult problem to solve in some ways. But even with beaver flooding, we've got options. This is what's called a flow device. It's basically a pipe and fence system. And the way it works is that you run that pipe through the beaver dam or through the road culvert and just drain the pond. You're just creating a leak in the dam, basically. You're moving water from the upstream side of the dam to the downstream side via that pipe. You've got the cages here to protect the entrance of the pipe, right? Because if beavers figure out that this is the leak, they're going to plug it up. So you can sort of use these kinds of flow devices or beaver deceivers, as they're often called, to kind of strike a balance or compromise between humans and beavers, right? You can say, hey, we like having you here. We appreciate all the good stuff you do. We think the pond's important, but we don't want it flooding our driveway. And you can use one of these things to basically reduce the level of the pond to a height that is acceptable to the beaver and also tolerable for the humans. And I know this is probably a hard sort of visual to see in the back, but basically what researchers who have studied these devices have found is that these sorts of solutions are effective about 87 to 97% of the time. So they're not appropriate for every single situation, but there's no question there are lots of conflict sites where we're currently trapping out beavers, where we could be coexisting with them in a non-lethal, more humane way. Of course, the other option for troublemaking beavers is relocating them, right? Live trapping and moving them. And one of the reasons that I was really excited to move back to Washington is that Washington is actually the beaver relocation capital of the world, I would say. We've got the most progressive beaver-friendly laws that basically prohibit really, or allow rather, really sort of liberal beaver relocation around this state. And the original beaver bill was actually passed or sponsored by Joel Kretz, who's one of the state's most conservative wolf-hating lawmakers, but really loves beavers because he's a rancher and appreciates these kinds of stock ponds that beavers create, essentially. So, beaver relocation is a pretty nonpartisan or bipartisan issue in Washington, which I think is really cool. One of probably the biggest beaver relocation projects that we have in the state is the MetaBeaver Project, based in Winthrop, Washington, in the Methow Valley, where hopefully you guys have all been because it's an amazing place. And there, as you probably know, the Methow Valley is a huge apple-producing area, and obviously beavers and apples don't get along very well, right? This is sort of what happens when you combine beavers and apples. And for many decades, the Methow Valley's response to beavers was lethal trapping, right? Killing every beaver that caused this sort of problem. But in 2008, the MetaBeaver Project began live trapping beavers. This is a beaver live trap or a Hancock trap. It's basically a big metal suitcase, which you bait with some beaver lure, which is made from beaver scent secretions. So you kind of dab some of this stuff on one of those Hancock traps, leave it out overnight, and ideally catch yourself a beaver. I think that's a pretty handsome specimen. I like that beaver a lot. So when you live trap and relocate beavers, right, your goal is always to live trap and move the entire family together, right? Because if you catch the offspring, the juvenile beavers separately and move them by themselves, they're probably going to end up dead. You don't want to break up beaver families. So the goal, of course, is to move all the beavers together. But the problem is that a lot of the beavers you catch are going to be sort of lone wolf beavers. They're going to be juvenile, sort of teenage dispersing beavers who have just left their families and are looking for their own territory, trying to start their own family, and end up in an irrigation ditch or a stock pond or something. Those teenage beavers are the ones that get into trouble. So what the MetaBeaver Project does when they catch those beavers by themselves is they kind of operate this beaver Tinder service, this beaver dating program, where they pair up male and female beavers and try to create these compatible couples, which they can then move together. Because if you move one beaver, he's going to end up wandering around looking for a female. He's not going to build a dam and lodge to be safe, and he's going to get eaten by a cougar or something, right? You want to move these couples together so they start building right away. So this is Sandy and Chomper. This is one of the successfully paired couples on their way to be relocated. The problem, there's the big problem with this beaver matchmaking and relocation is that, so in this picture, Sandy is the female and Chomper is the male. Can you tell who is whom or which is which? No, right? So how do you tell a male beaver from a female beaver? So the problem with beavers is that they actually male beavers don't have external genitalia, which makes sense, right? If you're an animal that spends its whole life swimming around log jams, you don't want some little dangling thing that's going to get snagged on something, right? So beavers keep it nice and tucked up. They have internal genitals. But that makes it impossible to look at a beaver and know whether it's a male or a female. So how do you tell them apart? Well, you have to sniff them. This is a beaver's anal gland. Beavers have very poor eyesight, but very good hearing and amazing senses of smell. And they have two different sets of scent glands, the anal glands and the castor sacs. And they leave each other very sort of sophisticated, complicated scent messages. They mark their territories very, very effectively. And so what you do to determine whether a beaver is a male or female is you have to squeeze this scent gland, and those are my hands. This is sort of like this bizarre hazing ritual you have to go through when you visit the MetaBeaver Project. They make you sex a beaver. It's screwed up, I think. And you squeeze a dollop of this stuff onto a tissue, and you smell it. And if it smells like motor oil, it's a male beaver. If it smells like cheese, it's a female beaver. So now you guys know. If the opportunity ever arises in your own daily lives to sex a beaver, now you know how to do it. So I guess the big question in all of this, right, is why bother doing all of this stuff? I'm talking about fencing off trees and installing these elaborate pipe and fence systems and sniffing beaver butts to relocate them. What do beavers do that makes them so desirable? Why are they worth bothering with, given what a pain in the butt they can be? What do beavers provide us? And not that ecosystem services are the sole measure of an animal's worth, but certainly it's an important thing to think about and an important argument to make in beavers' favor. So of course the biggest thing that beavers do, the biggest service they provide, is they're really good at storing water, right? That's their whole job, or their whole reason for being is basically building dams and creating ponds. And in the arid American West, that's a really important function, not only for wildlife but for humans. So here's kind of a cool anecdote that illustrates this point really nicely, I think. This is a stream in Nevada called Maggie Creek. This is in sort of northeast Nevada in Elko County. And this picture was taken in 1980. And what you can see in this picture really clearly, I think, is that the stream looks like crap, basically, right? And this is basically the result of 100 years of unmanaged livestock grazing, right? Cattle are just sort of turned loose. They wander down to the stream. They browse all of the riparian or streamside aspen, willow, cottonwood. The stream banks destabilize, and you end up with this kind of very eroded, lifeless trench that doesn't support any life whatsoever and isn't really very beneficial for the rancher either. So in this case, the prescription was pretty simple. The Bureau of Land Management and the rancher who holds this grazing allotment basically worked together to put up some fencing, to change the grazing rotations, to basically keep the cows out of the stream bed and let some of that riparian vegetation recover, let those streamside plants grow back up. And they weren't really thinking about beavers when they made these management decisions. But again, beavers have this kind of magical way of finding their way back into systems. So beavers, they changed all of this, the whole grazing procedure or prescription in the early 1990s. And beavers showed up about 10 years later. And the next picture I'm going to show you is the exact same stream from the exact same place in 2017 after about 15 years of beaver recovery. So just keep this picture in your mind and then feast your eyes on what happens when beavers come back into the system. That's pretty cool, I think. So we went from this to this, thanks in large measure to beavers. And you might look at this picture and say, well, wait a second, what are beavers doing here exactly? I don't see any beavers. Well, all of this cattail growth is actually growth atop an old beaver dam. So beavers are so thoroughly incorporated into this ecosystem that vegetation is growing on top of their dams. I think that's pretty cool. So you can just look at this visual and know that this aquatic ecosystem is healthier than this one, right? It's very visually obvious. But because scientists were involved, of course, they quantified some of these changes as well. So thanks to beavers, this system, Maggie Creek, gained 20 acres of open water, right? So beavers building dams, creating ponds, creating these wonderful kind of aquatic habitats. Beavers actually added 3 miles of wetted stream length to this channel. So what does that mean? Well, that stream was so degraded that it was going dry in the summer and fall. It had ceased being a stream and just kind of become a dry wash or arroyo. So by slowing water down, beavers were ensuring that water remained in the stream, come August, September, October, right? So oftentimes, you hear landowners complaining about beavers stealing their water. Well, beavers aren't using the water. They're just slowing the water down, right, and ensuring that there's still water in that stream and turning it from a seasonal flow to a perennial one. Beavers also increased the water table by 2 feet, right? We were talking about this at dinner. So when you look at a beaver pond, there's all of the visible surface water you can see, but what you don't see is all of the water that's then percolating into the soil, raising that water table, recharging aquifers. Beavers are really good at storing groundwater. That's an important thing to bear in mind too. And the upshot of that is that beavers, by raising that water table and storing groundwater, beavers are basically irrigating this entire valley, right? So this valley in Nevada gained 100 acres of riparian vegetation thanks to this beaver groundwater storage sub-irrigation effect. And that's a big deal if you're this guy. This is James Rogers. He's one of the ranchers in northeast Nevada who's really come to embrace beavers thanks to kind of case studies like that. And the point that he made to me is that beavers basically increased production, grass production in this valley tenfold by irrigating this pasture. So again, this is a rancher, a guy whose father shoots beavers, but he himself has become a beaver believer, a member of the cult, because he's just experienced the benefits so powerfully firsthand. Another fantastic beaver function is flood mitigation, right? So we think about beavers as being agents of flood causing, right? They're inundating areas. But beavers are also really good at slowing down destructive floodwaters. This is a picture I took in Scotland where beavers are being reintroduced after about a 400-year absence. And there, of course, they have the opposite problem as us, right? Our issue is not enough rain. Their issue is excess precipitation, and they have these really destructive floods that just race through these catchments and do lots of property damage downstream. And beavers, by slowing water down, spreading it out, sinking into the ground, are really good at attenuating or mitigating flood flows. And what they found in the UK is that actually beavers are capable of capturing about 30% of these big rainfall events. You get a huge storm, all of this rainwater just rushes downriver, And when you've got beavers on the landscape, they capture about 30% of that potentially destructive floodwater. So beavers they're great at addressing drought by creating these ponds and wetlands, and they're also great at sort of mitigating the opposite of drought, flooding. So that's kind of a cool beaver function. And here's just a kind of a cool picture that illustrates this. I think this is in Colorado, up by Leadville a couple summers ago. And what you can see here very clearly is that here's the stream, and without beavers building all of these dams, this stream would just rush right through this valley like a straight string. But because of beavers, all of that water is being spread and stored and slowed. This is a pretty cool visual, I think. Another fantastic thing that beavers do that's especially relevant for us here in the Spokane River watershed is that they're really good at capturing pollution, right? When beavers slow down water, all of the suspended sediment and pollutants in the water table basically have an opportunity to settle out. So beavers are really filtering water at a very large scale. This is Lake Erie, one of the places with the worst water quality in the U.S., where they're having these almost annual gigantic algae blooms that basically renders the water undrinkable, and that's the result of industrial agriculture, essentially. All of this nitrogen and phosphorus basically being flushed into the lake. And beavers, by slowing down those flows, are really good at capturing a lot of that stuff. One study, this is a study that was done in the UK on a single pair of beavers. This is 2 beavers in, I think this is 6 years. Captured 100 tons of sediment, 15 tons of carbon, and a ton of nitrogen. So that's just 2 beavers, just capturing enormous amounts of sediment and sequestering it at the bottom of their ponds, essentially. So, when I moved here a year and a half ago, I looked at, a place like Hangman Creek, which flows into the Spokane River. Every spring, right, we see these brown chocolate milk-like flows coming out of Hangman, entering the Spokane River. To me, Hangman Creek is a stream that was historically very beavery. Beavers would have been up and down Hangman, slowing water down, capturing that runoff. And today we've got this channelized stream with agriculture right up to the stream bank, no vegetation. That's a system that, to me, could really benefit from the addition of beavers or beaver-like structures. And I know that work is happening. So there's lots of potential for beaver-based pollution capture in our own watershed, I think. Another really important function of beavers here in the Northwest is that they create fantastic salmon habitat. Right? This is a juvenile steelhead. This is in Central Oregon on the John Day River, and there basically the story. That's another stream, another watershed that had basically lost all of its beavers, and with the loss of beavers came a huge loss of salmon habitat. Right? If you're a juvenile salmonid, a steelhead or a coho or a chinook, you name it. You don't want to live in the main stem river, right? You're going to get blown downstream by spring melt. You want to live in a side channel or a backwater or an eddy or a deep pool. And beavers create that kind of complex habitat really nicely. So what scientists saw in this kind of John Day catchment is that when you added beavers to the mix, you saw a 50% increase in the survival of these juvenile steelheads. So this is a threatened fish that's surviving at a 50% higher rate thanks to the incorporation of beavers in a restoration strategy. So kind of a cool example of beavers boosting salmon production. Of course, the hang-up that a lot of fish biologists still have is, wait a second, don't we want to take dams out of streams right now? Right? Why are we introducing more barriers to fish migration? We're trying to eliminate dams on the Elwha River, for example, not add more dams that could get in the way of salmon. Well, to that, of course, beaver dams and human-built dams have very little in common, right? We build these gigantic impermeable concrete walls. Beavers build, these much lower woody structures that fish can jump over, swim around, even swim through in some cases. So, not that a single anecdote is data, but this is kind of a cool picture I took a couple of years ago. This is in western Washington, just outside of Seattle. And up there on the top right, you can see the Beaver Dam. And here, these two little pockets of gravel are two fresh dug coho salmon redds or nests. So at least in this stream, salmon had no problem whatsoever navigating beaver blockages. And in fact, scientists have documented individual steelhead crossing more than 200 dams, beaver dams, on their way to spawn, all of which inspires my favorite bumper sticker, which is that beavers taught salmon to jump, right? That's how deep this evolutionary connection runs. And the final beaver service that I'll talk about tonight is beavers are incredibly valuable climate adaptation tools in ways that we're just beginning to really understand. So of course we know that here in the Northwest, the land is turning, it's turning hotter and drier and much more fire prone. And beavers, by basically spreading water out on the landscape, are really good, it turns out, at creating these fire refuges or even fire breaks in some cases on the landscape. So here's a picture in Idaho. This is the Sharps Fire, which burned last summer, and I think this is like 100,000 acres or something. And you can see that all of those hillsides are basically blackened, burnt to a crisp. And the only green, wet, blue, lush place in the landscape is this beaver-influenced valley bottom. And there's not a lot of great peer-reviewed research yet on the beaver-fire connection, but that's something that we're just beginning to understand. And there's some cool publications coming out about beavers as fire breaks in the very near future. And the other fantastic thing that beavers do from a climate change perspective, so they're climate adaptation tools, but they're also climate mitigation tools. Right? They can actually keep carbon out of the atmosphere in the first place. So again, we know that beavers, they build these dams, they create these ponds, they settle out sediment. That sediment is very carbon rich. Here's a fantastic picture in Colorado, I think, that really illustrates this. Look at all of this amazing organic matter-filled sediment that has just built up behind this beaver dam over the course of many, many decades. So just as we might sequester carbon in a forest by planting trees, it turns out you can sequester a lot of carbon in a watershed by planting beavers. And again, that's another kind of emergent field of research that we're just starting to really wrap our heads around, is the role of beavers as a kind of a carbon capture technology. So given all of these wonderful benefits, why aren't beavers more universally beloved or accepted upon the landscape? Well, to me, the issue is really we don't, as I said in the introduction, we don't really know what our landscapes are supposed to look like, right? We humans are kind of fanatical micromanagers of nature. We like our streams, straight and channelized and bracketed by riprap, and we like our crops in parallel rows, and we like our water where we can kind of keep it. And beavers do the opposite of that, right? They move water all over the landscape, they kill all of these trees, they create these ecosystems that don't really cohere with our idea of what a healthy landscape should look like. But again, of course, we know that these sorts of beaver-influenced or beaver-mediated systems are in many ways much healthier than systems without beavers. And I think that my beaver mentor is this guy Kent Woodruff, who kind of created the MetaBeaver Project. And the point that he made to me is that, look, we spend billions of dollars trying to heal our planet, right? We use backhoes and bulldozers and all kinds of heavy machinery to basically fix what we screwed up, to re-engineer healthy aquatic ecosystems. But we don't know what those systems used to look like, right? Especially we white people, we weren't here 1,000 years ago when beavers kind of had the run of the place. So by getting out of the way and letting these animals kind of do the work for us, we can really accomplish a lot. And they also don't need permits. That's another really valuable thing about beavers. They just do this work without having to deal with the Army Corps of Engineers. So add it all up, and the mantra of the Beaver Believers, the members of the beaver cult, is let the rodent do the work, right? Let's step back, get out of the way, bring these animals back to our lands and waters, and let beavers begin to solve some of the problems that we've created. So thank you guys very much. And the one very self-serving thing I'll add is that if you guys I do have some books, so we can do a Q&A for a few minutes if you want, and then if you guys want a book, I'll be outside. So thank you guys so much.
So you talked about how beavers can sequester pollution in different areas, but I was just wondering, like, how that might work in somewhere like the Lower Coeur d'Alene River Basin, where there's a lot of like lead and cadmium pollution. So if they like build a dam there and sequester all that pollution in that still water, and then all those animals that rely on wetlands are exposed to all that pollution, do you think there would be any negative impacts on those organisms?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that you would need. So the answer is that we don't really know. That sort of research hasn't really been conducted yet. There are a few projects underway, but I think it really depends on the time scale, right? I mean, given long enough, you can probably lock up a lot of those heavy metals under several layers rather of sediment. So I think it's certainly possible that these beaver created wetlands in places like the Lower Coeur d'Alene might be initially toxic in some ways, but given enough time, I have to imagine that a lot of that pollution would just get locked up. It's a great question.
So you do a great job in the book explaining different state departments and their work with beavers. Do you think that's the most effective way to start this process? And then also within the State Department, there's a lot of conflict with farmers or with the transportation industry.
Yeah.
What coalitions do you think will kind of help bridge the gap to make it more effective to bring beavers back? Yeah,
that's a great question. I mean, to me, one of the cool things about beavers, right, is that we, whatever you think of the current administration, right, we live in this time when we can expect no conservation help from the federal government. But fortunately, beavers are this hyper-local issue that doesn't actually require very much federal intervention. Right? We can still make a lot of conservation progress working with state agencies, county road crews, private landowners. So to me, the most effective sort of gap bridgers, to use your term, are people like that rancher James Rogers. These landowners who are having this very personal experience with these animals, who can then speak to their peers and convince other landowners to embrace beavers in ways that a writer with a ponytail never could, right? So I think that's the most successful coalitions on the beaver front that I see are the ones that are being led by landowners, with some conservation or environmental group support in the background, but with the voices of ranchers really front and center. So yeah, James Rogers. There's Jay Wild is a great rancher in Idaho who's kind of done the speaking rounds over the last year or so, talking to his agricultural community peers. It's guys like that, I think, who are the most effective spokespeople for the issue.
Ben, could you just add the Lands Council's project and how that has worked locally?
Yeah, totally. The Lands Council is a fantastic beaver advocate. They've done a lot of beaver relocation around eastern Washington. I think they've moved something like 130 beavers over the last few years. They also install those flow devices, those non-lethal pipe and fence systems that I talked about. And they do lots of beaver education events too, and that's really essential as well, is to change the public perception of this animal. So the Lands Council is a fantastic beaver group, and the Spokane Riverkeeper too is doing more and more on the beaver front, including in Hangman Creek. They've got some beaver dam analog projects up there, basically, beaver mimicry projects using these sort of woody dams to sort of simulate the effects of what beavers do, and then hopefully get beavers back into the system to do the work themselves. So the Lands Council and the Riverkeeper both doing a lot of good beaver work.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Do they get protected in any way? Yeah. No. The answer is no. And I think that's it's I mean, how much beaver protection or conservation we should be doing that's another really sort of hot button question. The conflict that we have in the West, right, is that we've got the federal agencies, usually the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, who are in charge of managing the physical land itself, right, the habitat. And then you've got the state agencies, Fish and Game or DFW or whoever, that manages the wildlife. And so oftentimes you've got the federal agencies say, hey, we want beavers back in here. They're doing great stuff for the habitat. Let's relocate them. Let's bring them back into this ecosystem. And then you've got the state agency basically permitting trapping in the exact same place that that the other arm of the government is trying to encourage beavers. So you've got the state and the federal agency kind of working at cross purposes, and now there's a lot of there is a lot of momentum in many Western states, including Washington, to really restrict or even ban commercial and recreational fur trapping, exactly because we understand how important these valley bottom ecosystems are, and that's where the trappers know the beavers are there too, right? So it's kind of a big values question. Do we think that some trapping should be permitted? It's sort of part of the historical fabric of the West. It's many people's it's a really important form of recreation for many people. Should we permit that, or should we say, hey, this is an animal that's providing us millions and millions of dollars in ecosystem services, and it should be protected. So right now, beavers are not really protected, but that is, I think, changing in many places.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks, Brian.